there's been a real increase in some different climatic conditions that postal workers have had to face. The smoke is the biggest one. I come from Saskatoon here. This last year wasn't as bad, but the couple prior years to that, smoke was affecting people every single day as they're out there walking, driving, and delivering. There's been ice and freezing rain storms that have been uncharacteristic. I know in Saskatoon we had a week where that had happened, and due to sort of lack of proper management and health and safety protocols, members had been getting injured. There was about 12 injuries in a week span. One of them, a carrier, broke their hip. Delivering community power, what the campaign is meant to be, right? It brings in new revenue for the company, which is always needed, but it also serves the community. And then we want to go outside of that and service the global community as well.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada by Sierra Club Canada. I'm your host, Connor Curtis, Head of Communications at Sierra Club Canada, and today we are going to be talking about Canadian postal workers' campaign to expand postal services and fight climate change at the same time, why this could be a win-win-win for Canada Post, for people and for communities, and we're going to chat about the recent strike and ongoing fight for fairness for postal workers. Brom Enslin is joining me. He is the president of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers Saskatoon Local, that is CUPW as an acronym, and he was the regional organizer for the CUPW's Delivering Community Power campaign, which is pushing for that greener postal service. Before we begin, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and on CHMA Radio in Sackville, New Brunswick on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Atlantic Daylight Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us. Brom, thank you so much for joining me today. For those tuning in, who are you and what do you do?
Hi, so thanks for having me. My name is Brom Enslin. I'm on Treaty 6 territory here in Saskatoon, and I'm a postal worker. I started out, and I still am, in RSMC. That's a rural and suburban mail carrier. And I'm now, for the last, say, about 2 years, I've been local president here in Saskatoon, Local 824 with CUPW, Canadian Union of Postal Workers, and done various things throughout this. One of the things that I did for a little while was a coordinator for our Delivering Community Power campaign. So I spent about a year and a half promoting that campaign and sort of pushing for it to be accepted and endorsed within the public and politicians and all the way through to communities. So that'll be something we'll dive into, I think, a little bit more during this conversation.
Yeah, totally. And I talk, I think, hopefully a little bit about the support for communities aspect of the work that you're doing. The CUPW is calling for expanded, or essentially Canadian Union of Postal Workers, for those who don't know the acronym, is calling for expanded postal services and specifically for those postal services to be greener. Just quickly, why is this a focus for the union?
Well, so there's a lot I can say about this question that you've got. I guess first thing I can say is that it is something that our members believe in. It was voted into our constitution as one of our policies. That CUPW respect the environment. There's a bunch of things that, fundamental principles, such as to raise awareness of environmental issues, promote good environmental stewardship, respect for biodiversity, minimizing adverse effects on the environment, promoting conservation and wise use of all resources, just as sort of as the preamble. But there's a whole section in our constitution about the environment. So as a social union, we don't just take on things of the service orientation. It's something that we're a social union, an organizing union. So we involve ourselves in things that are larger than just within the membership, but also in society as well. So, firstly, there's a couple of parts. And so this is all based around sort of our Delivering Community Power platform as well. This is the campaign that I was mentioning before. If anybody wants to check more about that, they can always go to www.deliveringcommunitypower.ca. But there's a couple of aspects to it. And you spoke a bit about greening, but also the public service. And the first major part of it is that we do believe that the post office must remain a public service that serves all Canadians. So that's the idea of expanding the services, right? In the age of austerity, cuts, privatization, et cetera, Fortifying the public service by expanding the services not only creates new revenue for the post office that's claiming losses year after year, creates new opportunities for services that are new to be created in all communities, including those who currently have none, so that the post office can become a hub once again to bring people together in their community. That's the basis of the idea of expanding services. Right now, the trend is that communities are losing services over and over because private businesses such as banks, grocery stores, et cetera, they're closing down. Increasingly, members of smaller or more remote communities that have to travel to neighboring communities to get those services actually met. Some communities, especially Indigenous communities, have always had to do this. And so one of them, we're always looking at, the cuts that are coming to the post office, but rooted in that is the desire to make sure that the post office remains public service, because only the public service can serve all communities in the way that it has. And, often private businesses will, run the other direction, as I previously mentioned. So the idea of expanding the public services, it's win-win-win actually, but it brings in new revenues to the post office. As we said, they're always claiming losses, but it ensures communities have these new services. So that's the main part. The second pillar, of course, is the greening of the post office. The idea that, well, we have the largest fleet in the largest public fleet next to the military, which is not public, of course, but that are driving around the cities all day, every day, and we have the ability, along with retrofitting the buildings that we own, to really make an environmental impact by reducing that and by taking those cars off the road, replacing them with electric vehicles and changing things over, because that's the way of the future. And as these things are being implemented, we sort of want to make sure that workers have their rights protected, that there are jobs, that there are transitional elements built into the collective agreements. We believe that should be for not only CUPW, but for any industry, going forward. That those things are implemented into the collective agreements, so that we're not relying on big business again and private companies to be able to take care of that for us. So again, I sort of mentioned delivering community power. Some of the expansion of the services, and I guess I should say too, obviously, like when we say it's a win-win-win, it's, oftentimes you'll hear unions saying that there's a problem and there's an issue, but don't have things they're there for as solutions. And that's kind of what the campaign is meant to be, right? It brings in new revenue for the company, which is always needed, but it also serves the community. And then we want to go outside of that and service the global community as well. Delivering community power, it has that as its basic platform, those two main sort of arms. The main thing about expanding services is we've proposed new ideas, and some of those ideas you may have heard of. Postal banking is one of them. Charging stations, EV charging stations to be put into the post offices. Postal banking, I mentioned, rural internet as well. These are just some of the ideas that are going on, and the campaign is continuously evolving. But the idea, of course, is that these things can be provided to expand what the public can expect out of the post office, rather than losing that and again having to travel elsewhere to do it. There's post offices are in almost every community. Now, there could be a better job done, there could be more communities as well, but at this point, there's most communities across the country are serviced by a post office. Why not utilize that infrastructure to be able to offer these services, right? You can sort of, the idea of a community hub can be revisited by this, because you can, let's just use EV charging stations as an example. If you're using electric vehicles to get across the country, it's, pretty easy to go into the bigger cities and find some charging stations. But when you exit that and you enter the smaller communities and travel the grids, you really can't find them. It's not as easy to find. So it would just be wonderful to be able to have the opportunity to be able to do this, at your post office, and you can get some banking done. And there's a plethora of ideas that you can do. And that really will affect the smaller communities who I mentioned have to leave to have their services met, and, which includes driving to other places, having to use their vehicles to go kilometers away from where they live just to have their services met. I guess the other thing I would say too is that postal workers have really been seeing they're out in the communities every day, right? So why is the environment, important to postal workers? Well, if you look at the way things have been going over the little past while with climate change, there's been a real increase in some different climatic conditions that postal workers have had to face. The smoke is the biggest one. I come from Saskatoon here. This last year wasn't as bad, but the couple prior years to that, smoke was affecting people every single day as they're out there walking, driving, and delivering. So obviously there's been a huge increase in smoke. There's been ice and freezing rain storms that have been uncharacteristic. I know in Saskatoon we had a week where that had happened, and due to sort of lack of proper management and health and safety protocols, members had been getting injured. There was about 12 injuries in a week span. One of them, a carrier broke their hip. So these changes we really have to get ahead of, and we really have to be able to do our part, especially as the public sector, to be able to stop that from happening and to mitigate whatever we can through the channels that we have. And the ability, really, unions are really tied to health and safety as well. So with the involvement of the union, with the involvement of the public sector or the public service, you really can set these standards and I would say do a much better job than private can do. And that's why it's really important to us as postal workers.
And it's so
If
great
that
to hear
answers your
that
question.
that's a member initiated initiative, right? And
Yes.
the things
Yes.
it wasn't something I was initially going to ask about, but it makes so much sense now that you're saying it. You know, you often have members probably encountering a lot of these impacts, climate impacts on a regular basis in a way that other people wouldn't necessarily because we're just not covering that sort of distance in a given day, right? Like
Right.
we're certainly not going from community to community and then coming back to a central location. On that last note, I kind of wanted to talk about that because we often talk on the show and in general about how things are supposed to be green, and
Mhm.
it's better to do that through public services than private ones. Because with the public services, we tend to see is that we can actually monitor whether or not we're being effective towards that end.
Yeah.
Whereas with the private sector, it becomes very prone to greenwashing. You know, there's obviously examples of private sector industries that try to do this better than others, but always
Right.
it's much more opaque getting to that information to even tell if progress is being made. And given the alternative is often private postal services, is this a better way to provide that green alternative, right? Like you touched on this a bit before, but this seems to me to be a much more secure way of reaching those goals.
Yeah, one of them is, of course, we're always fighting. Like again, I mentioned about getting things into collective agreements. We're sort of fighting not just for our own workers, but for postal workers in general. Just or sorry, for workers in general and for the communities. That these things, this transition takes into effect the future, which is the environmental considerations, right? So we want to make sure that we have that, and so the member involvement is a really important thing because you have this other side, other than just the corporate desire, which is usually for profit. It always is for profit. The good thing about the public service is, typically is unionized and has the ability to take on these issues, whether it be health and safety, whether it be, the environment. Speaking for CUPW, I know that as I was working on the campaign, I was not involved in these committees, but the members of our national office were involved in committees such as an environmental committee. So, and I know some of the work that was done there in my time, I thought was really great. Again, you talk about corporations and how they sort of put up numbers, but we were able to have our workers on those boards and pushing for things. The climate targets that were being put out, the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. These are all things that we were able to push and make sure that Canada Post took into consideration. And when you look at their sustainability reports, a lot of the work was done on those committees, and it had both sides. It didn't just have management; it had the union involved. There are always still going to be problems with it, even with the public service. You're still dealing with a corporation in this example.
Mhm.
We're worried about that and continuously trying to make sure that they're not greenwashing. One of the good examples is, okay, they've agreed to these climate targets and to look at their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. But one of the biggest issues, not to get too dirty into the details, but one of the big issues that we're seeing right now is that they don't. What I am as an RSMC, we provide our own private vehicles, like our own personal vehicles, in order to deliver the work.
Oh, okay.
And right now, Canada, and that's just a section of workers. There's only, I'd say, just under 10,000 out of the 55,000.
Mhm.
But that's still quite a bit. And with all of those vehicles, they fall under scope 3 emissions, which are contracted work and other work, which we are not contractors. So one of the things that we're pushing to no resolution yet is to include RSMCs in that calculation, because those are certainly commissioned by the corporation to go out there. And if you're not including a lot of the work that's going to the smaller towns because it's a private vehicle, well, it's not really, it's very easy for them to say that they're fulfilling their climate obligations through scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, but not scope 3. So that's just a bit of inside baseball, but it's sort of some of the things that we've been able to and are constantly working at, and being able to be on the ground floor with them or in the boardroom with them to make sure that they do take those things seriously, rather than just sort of saying, here's what we're doing. We can constantly hold them to task.
Yeah, exactly. And it is interesting how there seem to be these carve out exceptions that, and I can see that because, like, being from a more rural place originally myself, right? Like, you have a lot of communities, a lot of the actual transport distance stuff that you're probably doing is back and forth to those communities. And I mean, on that note, too, the Postal Service definitely, when I was growing up and to this day, continues to play this very important role that I think we don't always think about. I remember interviewing some Canada Post workers for a really small
Mhm.
publication I was part of years ago, and they were talking about how they were fulfilling these unknown roles in communities, like checking in on people who can't leave their homes and
Yes.
don't get visitors on a regular basis. There were all these other social things that seem to be happening. And I'm wondering if there are benefits to an expanded green postal service like this that go beyond what we normally think about.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Delivering community power platforms has a couple things, and I know you mentioned seeing people that checking in on people. We do have what, as part of the platform, something called elder check-ins. Now, that's postal workers are in the community, every day, right? They're out there walking, they're out there, talking to people, and one of the things they take most pride in is this being a part of that community and being a member of that community. And something that postal workers have sort of unofficially done over the years is you have the ability to see if there's anything that has changed in somebody's home or the ability to intervene if there's a crisis or something like that. But it's not officially part of the duties. It's something we do as virtue of being part of those communities. And one of the things that we're trying to push for in delivering community power is the idea of an elder check-in system, whereby we can officially, people can sign up and, to have people sort of check in. And that can be things like your mail is piling up, doors are left open, some of the stuff that we do unofficially right now, but to have it recognized as something that can be done in collaboration with healthcare as well. So that it wouldn't be postal workers walking in there providing healthcare services, but it would be alerting healthcare or management to being able to bigger, larger issues in the community as well. And of course, we are a proponent of being out there walking still. We'd like to be walking rather than this idea of driving from CME and group box to group box, so that we can maintain that idea. And of course, that is greener by nature, but we don't want to get rid of that. We don't want to rely on the motorization because some of those things can go by the wayside. I think that's a really good thing that postal workers have done over the years, have been able to check in on seniors or those with mobility issues. And there should be some way that included with all of this stuff that they should be able to provide that service for communities as well. And, delivering community power, the good thing about that idea is that it doesn't just stop with the platform that you'll see if you go to deliveringcommunitypower.ca. There's a lot of other ideas. I know that as a coordinator, we discussed ideas like bringing farm to table. So having the postal hub being the ability to have food and local providers providing these things as well. So it goes a little bit beyond, talks about providing these services, but doing so in a green way, so that all communities are serviced.
Yeah, and I can see that, going door to door, and for instance, you notice somebody's mail is piling up, that they don't leave their house much, and just being able to alert somebody how valuable that is, especially for a community. And I do think it's something that is not just applicable to, say, a smaller community, but also even just in a city. I mean, there's no reason to believe, your neighbors necessarily check up on you or something, or would
Oh,
notice if something's gone wrong. Sort of talking about that fight against privatization and cutting of
yes.
services. You're currently in a fight on that note. I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about that and what's happening.
Yeah, it's first thing that I want to point out is one of the major demands that we've had now. We were just in a labor dispute. I would say we still are in a labor dispute as things go on. One of our major demands was the expansion of the services. We wanted to make sure, and that was one of our core demands. But as we see the way that this has gone on, we obviously admonish the work of the government to come in here and order us back to work, especially not through legislation. One of the things that we were fighting, well, there's many things. I could go on many different tangents on this one, but the vision of the post office, as you sort of have alluded to, seems to be the major difference in our visions. Obviously, they're looking to cut. And if you look at the narrative that's in the news, they're looking to cut, cut, cut. Actually, if you look at some of their demands, they wanted to reduce the amount of corporate retail post offices, which are what are mostly in the small communities. So these are the things that we're fighting, and we can sort of tell, and we've been looking at this for years, ever since the Conservatives sort of implemented their postal transformation, that they are looking to sort of either devalue or look to potentially privatize the post office. And so this has been a major problem. And at the core of it is just this, the need for this service to remain public, because in all of the arguments that are being made, it seems to be understated how important it is to have service like this, not only for lower costs, but for better service throughout the communities. And I think the biggest thing, not only are we worried about our jobs and all the things that come along with it, we're genuinely worried about the service that communities will face in this sort of fight to keep relevant. And I will say they don't mention it. There's not a whole lot of talk. But again, if you follow the news, you'll see a lot of discussion on reducing the amount of postal workers and reducing the way that the services are. And I've seen this before. I in Saskatchewan here, we had a provincially run bus service, the Saskatchewan Transit. And it was almost the very same arguments that it was losing money. The difference, I guess, is that in that case it was taxpayer funded. The Canada Post Office is not taxpayer funded, but it is self-sufficient. But in this case, it was. But that being said, the scale wasn't as big either, and there was a big discussion politically about getting rid of it, and the promise that private would come in and just continue to service those communities. And I can say now, I'm not too sure how many years, it feels like at least a decade, if not more, those services have not come back. Social services and other entities that used that service now have to use taxi cabs to go throughout the province, which is infinitely more expensive. And I guess it's all to say that I've heard this argument before that we need to go towards a private model to be able to service the communities better. But we know, especially with the post office that is in every community already, that that's the only way that that's going to be. We're worried about this idea of privatization and sort of the advent of the gig workers, because that's something that, these gig workers in a lot of cases are contractors. I know there's been some fights to make it known that they are dependent contractors, but in most cases they're independent contractors who don't have, the same regulations and the same goals, right? If we need to go to every single community, it's those private businesses that aren't going to do it. And we know that because they haven't yet. Canada Post is still used as the last mile delivery for all these communities. So again, sort of, I know I'm kind of going everywhere with that, but all to say that the fight for the public service is now, where this is happening right now. We're unfortunately having to battle this, and we can see fairly clearly that if we're going to move towards privatizing the post office, that our services will dwindle. And that's exactly the opposite. We Delivering Community Power campaign put out a survey. It was, I believe, in 2021. And the majority of Canadians that were polled randomly were asking for an increase in public services. And when I spoke to communities, whether it be the Reeves, the mayors, the councillors from communities at the different municipality conferences, almost 100% of them just wanted better service within their community. And unfortunately, when you hear this stuff on the news, it's meant to be able to convince people of that. But we know that what people want is the exact opposite. So it's a fight to keep the public service robust, generally speaking, but also with the post office. And also our right to strike, assemble, and to collectively bargain is also at risk with the way things happened as well.
Oh, we see that kind of argument made across a lot of services, I think, and it's often also the environmental argument that we see is like, well, if we just let private industry sort of take care of things, then somehow it will magically be better, and then it always gets worse every single time. It's like there's
Right.
some decline in the service, or then later there's a scandal because something's gone wrong, or we erode the service, and then when there's a need for it, suddenly, like something goes really, in the case of health services is a good example, right? Like it's slow erosion of that.
Yeah.
And then we have a pandemic and we're suddenly stuck there with, semi-private services that can't cope with what's going on because
Absolutely.
they were never thinking in a public mindset. They were thinking in a private mindset. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. I mean, it's great to chat to
Very well.
somebody and workers who are doing this kind of work. So I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to say before we go, or ways people can find out more.
Yeah, no, I'll revert people back to deliveringcommunitypower.ca. It has the entire platform there. It shows, the great thing about the campaign is that it comes from other things that have worked in other countries. So it's not just sort of a dream idea. It is actually things that have worked elsewhere. So I definitely encourage people to go through that page. That it'll show the survey there as well, that people took that had mentioned that it was something that they would like to see an expansion of their services. So, and then of course, CUPW.ca has more about our union, other things that you can find there. But no, I would just say that this is to me, this is a really, really important fight. And again, it's something that it might be understated in the media. It doesn't seem to necessarily make its way out because I think that may be the plan, obviously, with the media. But we do have to hold on to our public services. And this is a big fight for that public service now when we're talking about, especially in dealing with what happened with this strike and with what it seems like they're moving towards. There's been no better time, I would say, than now to make sure that the public is aware of what actually could happen to their post office if we go down this road and if we listen to what some of the economists and what some of the people are saying about our public service. And it's really important that we understand what it is that we're looking at and what we can achieve here to expand our public service so we can demand that. So I would ask that everybody, take a look at what the platform looks like, what the campaign looks like, do everything you can. The best way we can have these things change, because we are talking about a movement here, a change. is to have those conversations one-on-one with their friends, with their families, and all the way up to demanding it from our politicians. Because, once we have these conversations, it really is somewhat, to me, I mean, maybe it's because I've been doing this for a while, but it's a no-brainer. It's a win-win-win scenario on all parts, but ultimately it's left up to political will. We know that the public service is that sort of social safety net when things go awry. You mentioned COVID. We can see what happens when private business tries to step in or doesn't try to step in, and how people fall through that safety net. So it's really important that people demand that their services remain public, and specifically the post office, so that the communities can not only continue to be serviced, but they can enhance the amount of service that they've seen. And I'll say this too: we are trying to get in a very respectful way. We're trying to ensure, and this is the union, not the corporation. We're trying to ensure that all communities, including Indigenous communities, are helped or serviced in a way that they would like, in a way that promotes their culture, and a way that promotes diversity right across the board. In the way that these services are provided. And obviously, we don't want to repeat the same mistakes of the past and to try to offer things in a disingenuous way. We want that to come from the communities. And to some degree, we saw a little bit of movement there. We had some discussions with Indigenous communities to have community hubs formed. And I believe there was 4 of them that were started, and in no small part due to the pushing of the union on making sure and encountering, connections with these nations, and making sure that they're involved in that. So I would say that if there's any communities that are underserviced, that are not serviced, that please reach out. You can always reach out to CUPW. There's a CUPW in almost every city. And sort of demand this of the corporation to say, hey, we can provide a better service, and we need to do so for all communities, and including the global community. Since we have such a large fleet and such a large footprint, we have a lot of change we can make in small time. It's just the political will that's necessary to invest.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining. I do think that touches on another thing that we often talk about, which is where we see these things cast as like it's the environment versus the economy and people's well-being, and it doesn't have to be that way. So, and where, yeah, it's also about like making sure everybody is getting service, no matter where they are, no matter what community they're a part of, so that they are getting service they actually need. Thank you so much again for joining me today.
Oh, thanks for having me. I really appreciate you reaching out. Thank you.
Hi, so Connor Curtis jumping back into the Q&A today, and before we get into the Q&A section, just a quick note that the answers we give here are just on behalf of ourselves at Sierra Club Canada. They're not on behalf of our guests. One subject that keeps coming up in conversations that I often have is around the connections between workers' movements and labor movements and the environmental movement, and the overlap there. And I thought the Q&A today would be a good time to talk about that in a general way and chat about why we need to strengthen that overlap. So first of all, just to say that there is significant overlap, and I think part of that is down to just the fact that when you tend to see people who are concerned with environmental causes, and we did discuss this a bit in the interview just before, oftentimes these are the people who are most affected, right? And so those people are in turn often workers working somewhere. And that overlap means that there is significant overlap between environmental movement and the labor movement. But it does depend a lot upon like what aspect of the environmental movement we're talking about, because it's a very varied movement with a lot of different causes that don't necessarily always correlate to each other. Vast majority very valuable, but just very different. So whether or not we're talking about like biodiversity, or if we're talking about climate change, or if we're talking about more the scientific aspect of environmentalism, which can go into more, again, science and that aspect, and scientific advocacy, research advocacy. Again, there's overlap there as well with the union movement and the labor movement, because as you may or may not know, a lot of university workers, a lot of researchers are members of unions, and therefore there is an overlap there between, the interests of that research often and the question of union involvement. So there's lots of overlap between the two. I think one thing that maybe we could learn a lot from the labor movement and the union movement in doing things within the environmental movement is the concept of solidarity. Because one thing the union movement has done historically very well is unite a lot of workers with a lot of different perspectives on varying issues. And, we tend to sometimes boil down unionism and union activity to working on just wages or working on just working conditions. I hope that this podcast today has actually helped to show that that's not the only thing unions do. But I do think that often one thing they do right that we could learn more from an environmental movement is bringing people from a very wide range of different concerns under one roof and being able to unite underneath that, and being able to unite in a way that doesn't mean we have to agree upon absolutely everything, because again, if you talk to most workers, they're going to have very different views on different subjects, and just because they're even in the same union or fighting the same fight for, say, better working conditions or something that they want to see or expanded services doesn't necessarily mean they're going to share the same views on everything. And the same is true of the environmental movement. A lot of different people, a lot of different thoughts on things, a lot of different conceptions. I think sometimes we let our differences become the topic of conversation rather than our similarities and the overlap. We've talked about this a little bit in our full spectrum resistance episode that Jessica, my co-host, did that was really good with Eric McBay, about how we don't need to agree upon everything to make progress, and we don't even need to use the same tactics or strategies in order to make progress. This is something unions are very good at, comparatively sometimes with the environmental movement, and that's a generalization. I'm not going to say that that's true in every case. I've been very lucky to be part of an organization that is a member-based charity where a lot of the work we do is member-driven, where it's grassroots. Often when I'm involved in the grassroots aspect of environmentalism, I do feel that unison and that uniting around common cause, despite again, various different viewpoints. And that happens at the national level with a lot of organizations that I know. And, we've been very lucky to work in coalitions on various environmental topics. So this does happen. I just think that there's a strengthening that can probably take place. And there's a larger sharing that we need to do too. The union movement and the environmental movement, I think, increasingly are already sharing a lot of concerns with each other. And increasingly, that's going to be the case. Why? Because, environmental issues are social issues. Environmental impacts are social impacts. They're impacts that impact people who are often the most vulnerable people within society. And often when we're fighting an uphill struggle for climate action or against pollution or for some sort of change in the way we treat the environment, there's a lot of overlap there with people who are fighting an uphill struggle for fair wages, safe conditions for their communities. And unions do a lot of work as well that's already on environmental topics and are already taking stances that are on environmental issues and recognize this. And so I do think there needs to be more direct conversation between the union movement on one side and the environmental movement on the other side, because for one thing, our concerns and the things we care about already overlap a huge amount, and that's only going to get more true in the future. And so coordinating that way, and again, maybe not always agreeing on everything, but being able to actually sit down and talk and coordinate is really key. And again, I'll bring that back to the most successful movements I've ever seen in terms of activism in general have been ones that could bridge gaps, that could bring people together, and that could create a united movement around core values and beliefs that we all hold and we all share. And I think the other important thing to keep in mind is that we should, as an environmental movement, be working closer with unions as well to make sure that there isn't artificial division caused. One thing that happened during the Canada Post strike that was noted online was that a lot of journalistic sources were covering end-of-year donations as an issue that was tied into the Canada Post strike, and it was, but the way they were covering it was as if the workers fighting for their rights was really hurting NGOs, and that was a huge problem, and the NGOs were upset about it. And that was artificial. That aspect of it is very artificial, because I can speak on behalf of Sierra Club Canada. We were standing in solidarity with Canadian postal workers. We did not want to see their rights diminished in that situation. I think a lot of the environmental charities and NGOs that I sort of put out statements on this said something similar. Yeah, these artificial constructs that tend to be pushed either by an agenda or because there's just a good story there about some sort of fight between two people that isn't real. That's a reason that we should be working closer with union movements as well, and with labor movements and with workers' movements, in order to actually show solidarity and to be clear in what we're saying, to be clear in our communications. Because unfortunately, if we've seen one thing, is that there is often this push to divide us, and we have to stop that. So I hope today's interview has been part of that, and I hope today's Q&A has been an interesting one for you. Please do write in with your questions to us at info@sierraclub.ca. We're looking forward to answering them. Before we go today, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions, events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and on CHMA Radio in Sackville, New Brunswick on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Atlantic Daylight Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us.